Hey guys, what's up? I'm Erin and welcome back to the channel. While we currently find ourselves facing high inflation, there's another economic threat making headlines, and that is stagflation. And stagflation is kind of when our economy short circuits a bit. On its most basic level, it's a term used to describe when an economy is experiencing inflation while simultaneously experiencing weak economic growth. And there are a couple factors that come into play when we consider stagflation. First up, we have negative GDP. Our GDP is a collective measure of our economic output as a nation. It is all the goods and all the services that we as a country produce. Traditionally, over time, our nation's GDP has risen, although periods of negative growth are not unheard of, but overall, the trend is upward. Measures on the GDP are released every single quarter, so every 3 months. But this data is delayed a bit because it takes a while to take a ruler to the entire country. So while we will wrap up Q2 of this year at the end of June, the first data on Q2 will not be available till the end of July. However, for Q1, the months from January to March of this year, we did experience negative GDP growth. The next component of stagflation is an overall reduction in the demand for goods and services. If the demand for goods and services decline, naturally businesses will sell less of these and then their overall profits will decline. Now, this is not something we're experiencing right now. The demand for goods and services is remaining very elevated post-pandemic. Supply chain issues have prevented things from being delivered in a timely fashion, so it very well could be that our demand is artificially propped up because of these supply chain issues. More importantly, there's a psychological component to economics. If enough people are concerned about the economy, concerned about inflation, concerned about a potential recession, or concerned about looming stagflation, they could actually trigger stagflation to occur. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If people think it's going to happen, they alter their behaviors, namely their spending behaviors, and they can actually trigger it to happen. If a significant number of consumers fear stagflation and decide to buy significantly less goods and services, they can actually drop the demand for goods and services. That's partly what makes economics so complex. It's not that you're just simply analyzing businesses and balance sheets. Rather, you're analyzing the behaviors and the anticipated behaviors of millions of people. And people are kind of complex. The next marker of stagflation is rising unemployment. And again, this is not something we're currently experiencing. In fact, our nation's current unemployment rate is sitting at 3.6%. which is actually the lowest we've seen in 30 years. However, it's pretty easy to see that all of these items are interconnected. If there's a situation that drastically reduces consumer demand, corporate profits will reduce, and following suit, we'll have layoffs. And finally, the last key marker of stagflation is inflation, a generalized increase in the price of goods and services, which is definitely something we're experiencing right now. So in a nutshell, stagflation occurs when the overall economy is kind of stagnant, all while inflation is occurring. Stagflation is a big old negative Nancy coming to the party. If you think about it, consumers are happiest when prices are low, when the economy's booming. Stagflation's pretty much the opposite of that. Prices all around you are increasing, but businesses are in a slump, which throws the stock market into a slump. And then throw in on top of that the added risk that you could lose your job. It's not the happiest of times. And also, if stagflation starts, it can be a hard cycle to break. It starts with inflation wrapping up. A small amount of inflation over time is totally normal. In fact, the central banks actually aim for a 2% inflation rate over time. When inflation ramps up, the central banks only have a limited toolbox in an attempt to bring it down, namely monetary supply and interest rates. When they increase interest rates, that makes borrowing more expensive for consumers, which can help to reduce demand. But that could also act as a catalyst for stagflation. Remember, consumer demand, business profits, and employment levels are all tied together. They rise together and they fall together. The last time our economy experienced stagflation was back in the 1970s, which I wasn't alive for, so I had to research it. The high inflation of the 70s and the subsequent stagflation was caused by one thing. Just kidding, nothing in economics is ever caused by one thing alone. It was caused by a mixture of oil prices, unionization, political pressures, and central banks, just to name a few. Today is different. Our current economic situation is different from that of the 70s. While we are experiencing inflation we haven't known since that time, the reason we're experiencing it is different. The surge in prices for goods and services bore largely from the pandemic, when factories were shut down and supply chains came to a screeching halt. But the thing is, consumer demand remained high. Just because people were staying at home doesn't mean they suspended their Amazon accounts. They were still shopping en masse. Our food and oil prices are being affected by Russia's war on the Ukraine. It's halted one of the world's major oil producers as well as one of the world's largest wheat producers, which is affecting the world on a global scale. These events have actually caused the World Bank to adjust what they anticipate global economic growth to be. In January, the anticipated global economic growth rate was 4.1% for this year, but it's been since adjusted down to 2.9%. It's also worth mentioning that the concern for stagflation isn't just isolated here to the United States. It is truly a global event. Just as it's making headlines here in America, it's also making headlines in Australia and in Europe. Remember, stagflation has a psychological component to it. If enough people believe it will happen, they may alter their behavior in a way that actually causes it to happen. We have one more metric that we can look at to see if stagflation is on the horizon, and that is the misery index, which is a terrible name for an index because, hello, misery. This was actually something that came about in the 1970s, and it helps to measure consumer sentiment. The misery index tallies unemployment levels and inflation. And in 1980, it hit an all-time high of 20.6. Since then, we haven't experienced a number that high, but it is creeping its way back up. Today, it sits at 12.1. Now, it's like golf. Lower numbers are better. Rising numbers indicate a worsening situation. So is there any way we can avoid stagflation? Well, maybe. First and foremost, we have one thing going for us, and that's that our nation has actually experienced stagflation before. Back in the 1970s, everyone was sort of just scratching their head trying to figure it out because they had never seen anything like it. So it does bode well that as a nation we've been through it before. We know what to expect this time around. Maybe it doesn't mean they can prevent it, but it does make it less of an enigma. We could always hold out hope for that ideal world scenario where the Federal Reserve engineers a perfectly smooth, soft landing, where they bring down inflation rates, they bring up interest rates, and just sort of even out consumer demand. Okay, I hear it too, but a girl can dream. The only known way to fight stagflation is to push the economy into a recession. But also keep in mind that we've only experienced stagflation once before. So saying that this is the only known way to fight it is like saying, well, it worked that one time, so it works all the time. The logic behind the recession is that high unemployment, which happens during a recession, is an easier battle to fight than constantly rising prices, which is inflation, something we're currently experiencing. So it's choosing the lesser of two evils. Because if you can reduce consumer demand, you can halt rising prices, and rising prices is really one of the primary drivers of stagflation. Ideally, the government would want to act quickly because these changes can take months or years to have their full impact. But keep in mind that anytime the government takes an action, there will be unintended consequences that come along with the intended consequences. And if you're at all curious about this, pick up the book Freakonomics or Freakonomics 2, which is a hilarious take on government unintended consequences. Okay, maybe hilarious isn't the right word to use, but it's really interesting and very eye-opening. If you've read Freakonomics or Freakonomics 2, leave it in the comments down below. But if stagflation were to occur, pushing the economy into a recession can be seen as a more desirable outcome because a typical recession lasts about 6 to 8 months, and 6 to 8 months of hard times can be seen as more desirable than years of just trudging along in misery and stagflation. Ultimately, the long-term consequences of stagflation is financially hard times as inflation eats away at the value of the dollar and rising unemployment. It's also worth keeping in mind that we aren't in a situation of stagflation right now. At this time, it's just speculation. If you want to sound optimistic about it, you could say that our stagflation glass is half full. Yes, we currently have high inflation and we do have a negative quarter of GDP thus far under our belt. It could happen, but maybe it won't. Much of the outcome depends on consumer sentiment and what they believe will happen. Remember that aspect of self-fulfilling prophecy. If people believe it's going to happen, they could alter their behavior in a way that actually triggers it to happen. What do you think is going to happen? Let me know in the comments down below. I post new videos every single week. If you got anything at all out of this one, please give it a like. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. Or if you know of someone who might get something out of this type of content, please consider sharing. I hope you have a good one. I'll see you soon. Bye. Yeah, I hear it. I know it's not happening. Accompanying those. Welcome back to the channel. I can't even say my name anymore. It's so hot. Hey guys, it folds twice and it makes it look like I have a lazy eye. Okay, can you open? It's not working. We'll have a reduced demand for goods. Whew. Supply chain issues have oh my God. Inflationary component to an inflationary pressures. Why can't I talk today? Is there any way oh my goodness. Goods and services. Oh gosh, if you think me playing with my hair when it's straight is bad, let's try it curly. That's way worse. As for global economic growth, profits, oh my gosh. Whew. Definitely experiencing that right now. Jeez, oh Pete's. Well, maybe.